I could sing. I really did. I thought I could sing until I was about 23. And then someone gave me a cassette tape of Lester Roloff. Then I learned how to sing. You know, he hit that word, and then he'd hit that word and sing like that. And I'm sorry, it just took hold. When we see Jesus, you know, and I learned to sing that, cheer up, my brother, you know. I tell you, he had a bad effect on me, just a bad effect on me. Let's sing that verse. When we see Jesus, here we go. When we see Jesus, just the chorus. Someone's going to greet you if you're seated, and when they do, we'd like you to stand with us. We're sure glad you're here. God bless you for coming our way. And so, choir, let's sing it. Farther along, together. Farther along. Wonderful. While our men are coming, we'll sing it one more time. Glad to have all these friends who visit with us. Seth and Julie over here. Wave at me, will you? God bless them. That's great. And Charlie just told me Miss Martin got to come home. That's great. Wonderful. God hears and answers prayer. And pray for Joe and Carol. God bless them. They're wonderful people. Wonderful people. Let's sing one more time. Just the chorus, and we'll have prayer here in a moment. Farther along, we farther along, we understand. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine.
Wonderful Savior is Jesus my Lord, amen? A wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul. It's hymn number 10. Turn there. Join me on that first verse. Every voice, please, on the first. A wonderful Savior is Jesus my Lord. A wonderful Savior to me. He hideth my soul in the in
All right, amen. Hope you're all doing well this afternoon on Tuesday. I'm just a few minutes behind schedule here. I apologize for that. I got stopped on my way. I usually pray and walk before I broadcast, and I have a gentleman that was saved like 3 months ago, listening not to our sermons but to somebody else's, and he asks me questions frequently. He's an older man. He's close to 70, I believe, somewhere around there. And he once in a while asks me questions, and I, of course, invite him to come to church. But anyway, yeah. So Satan's attacking me today already. Somebody, as usual, I'm being told that check out the Sword of Truth live stream. Why? Who cares? Nobody cares. Nobody watches it anyway. Anyway, about me, I guess I'm a racist or something. Whatever. Well, whatever. I've been accused of all kinds of things in my life. That's just another one added to the list. Now, and then I always know the devil's after me and attacking me. It just kind of comes in successions, and then some pervert just sends me some perverted thing, like he wants to rape me pretty much. So basically, what I say to things like that is this: get thee behind me, Satan. I have a work to do. I'm busy like Nehemiah building a wall, and I don't have time to play any of your games. I'll leave you to the Lord. Let me say this, though. I find it very interesting that comes over my cell phone at the same time that some sort of untruth is doing something about me. Seems like they have the same spirit. Maybe they work together. Who knows? But anyway, nobody really cares because nobody listens to that garbage anyway. People that have time to gossip all day about stuff that don't matter are people that need to go to work and get a job. Maybe Sword of Truth doesn't have enough to do. I don't know who Sword of Truth is. It's probably E.J. Love or one of his alter egos. That's not his real name or something. I don't know. Whatever. He changed his name. Who cares? Anyway, whatever. Whatever's clever, right? I guess it's going to happen. You're going to get attacked. It's just the way it goes. It's been one of those weeks. For the last week and a half or so, Satan's been attacking me nonstop. So I'm glad he revealed his hand today to show me that it's definitely him doing it, because I always get great comfort when I finally figure out that, hey, dummy, it's the devil attacking you. It actually helps me a lot when I find that out. The hard way that I'm being attacked by the devil. Anyway, but I'm just texting that person telling them to stop harassing me. I don't appreciate being sexually harassed by anybody, especially a sodomite. Yeah, I don't care if they're. Carl, I don't care if they are. Why? Because I'm talking about depression. I mean, why? Because I talked about sodomites the other day. Why? Because I preach the gospel every day. Why? Whatever. I don't care. Whatever. I don't have time to worry about those kids. They'll grow up someday. That's okay. They'll grow up someday. Here's the thing about these little fellers. These little fellers have always tried to stop me. I've had that my whole ministry. But you know something? God doesn't let them do it. He just deals with them. He just stirs up a hornet's nest in their own house, and they have to go deal with that. And that's usually what happens to all of them anyway. And then they go bye-bye and fly the coop somewhere, and they go hang out with in that cage of every foul bird. So, anyway, I don't even know who Christina Ricci is. So, whatever. Anyway, I'm not surprised that Satan's attacking me, are you? That's the way it goes. And if I had to worry about my name, well, I'll worry about Christ's name more than mine. I've been falsely accused since I've pastored my whole ministry. So let them do it. Let them rail. God will see what they're doing, and he'll deal with them. I don't need to. Why should I make them famous? They're proving me right about the charismatic movement. They're proving me right about sodomites. They're proving me right about these rogue street preachers that are out there that follow women around, because that's who started them stinking Pentecostal movements. A bunch of women, a bunch of Jezebels, and they're proving that the longer they go and what they do. So whatever, it is what it is. But anyway, how are all you doing? I hope you're doing good. If you ever need to know who I am, you can always ask me. But I think I'm a pretty much an open book. So, as far as that goes, I'm an open book. So, anyway, so I hope you're doing well this afternoon. Strange things, people. I'll tell you, people are funny. They're even more funny when they have devils with them. I learned to not to focus much of my time on people like that, because nobody really cares. The only reason why they use my name and then they sound clip me saying something, and I can already imagine what they're going to use, but if you listen to the whole thing, you get the whole point of what I said. But that's the way the devil works. That's the way they are. They have to sound clip you. They have to make you. But all I could say is, hey, I'm not the guy that has a restraining order against him because crazy people because people think you're crazy and you make them feel uncomfortable, and you have restraining orders against you and contact from people that don't want you to contact them. Yeah, that's not me that has that. That would be other weirdos out there playing superheroes on the internet. Anyway. Yeah, that's okay. Anyway, all right. Well, of course, Sword of Truth is broadcasting now. He knows I go on at 2:00, so he's got to broadcast at the same time. I mean, nobody cares, but he has to. Anyway. Let's see here. Romans 10:13 asks me, Pastor Cooley, who is the author of the book that mentioned the life of David? If you're talking about the one that I mentioned in that broadcast, or that sermon that I preached, I can't think of his name. I'm sorry, I can't think of his name. But I will tell you, it's not in print. You can't get it anywhere. There might be a few out there, but I'll remember it after a little while here. Well, I'm sorry that you all are being attacked because he hates my guts, but it's because I wouldn't give him a voice on here, so he got mad, and he wants to do his gotcha videos, and whatever. Anyway, just like all the other internet warriors in the night. No, it's not F.B. Meyer, no. Now, I did read Life of David by A.W. Pink, which is a very good book. I've read most of that. I haven't read all of it. I've read a lot of it. That's a very good book. But the one that I'm talking about, I have it. I don't know if it's here, if it's at home, but William Blakey, that's it, Scott. That's right, Brother Scott. William Blakey, that's the name. William Blakey, that's the name. So I don't know how many there are out there. It's kind of a scarce book, but it is well worth the read, let me tell you. All right, and well, whatever. he's just mad because I talk. Those people are just mad because I talk about charismania, and which is probably due for another one. Maybe I'll talk about charismania on Friday because it always just stirs me up to do more about that topic because it makes those devils so mad, and it glorifies God to bring the truth out of these people. So anyway, all right. Well, we are going to talk about something here that I have wanted to kind of continue to talk about here and try to help some people with because it's important. Now, this author brings out some things about Spurgeon's life. Charles Spurgeon was the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. Let's see here. He was the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. And from 1834 to 1892 he lived. And the man suffered some very, very, very intense depression at times. And it would debilitate him. It would basically just knock him down. And he wouldn't be able to do a whole lot. It would be so bad. Well, I could say that I recommend this book. Now, I'm going to tell you some things that I disagree about. I'm going to start doing some of these teachings on these book reviews once in a while. And I'm going to start doing them because I think they could be an encouragement to you to help you to learn to read. But also, I'll tell you with some things that I disagree with them about. And which I believe is important because you're not going to, when you read a book, you're not going to, besides the Word of God, you're not going to believe everything that they say. You're not going to agree with everything that they say. So it's important to be able to talk about that and say, you know what, I don't know. But this subject of depression is very near and dear to my heart because I've experienced it. I've dealt with bouts of anxiety and depression and things of that nature, and I know how it affects people out there. I also know that it's a taboo subject, that a lot of people don't want to talk about it. But I think what's very encouraging is that if you understand who Charles Spurgeon is, you understand that Spurgeon led, through his preaching, hundreds of thousands of people to the Lord. He preached to millions of people over his lifetime, and his books have went to millions more now. I think they said that he handed out, back in that time period, they sold those penny sermons for a penny or something like that. And literally they would they sold like 1 million copies of those things. I mean, millions of them. They found those copies of his sermons over in Africa. I mean, and places like that. So, I mean, Spurgeon's books were everywhere. And, I've heard people say a lot of things. Well, he was a Mason and all this and all that. Well, there's no proof of that. And I'm the first guy to go Mason hunting, believe me. And the first guy to do all those things. And I don't believe any of that's true. First of all, he was a very bad one if that was the case, because he preached the gospel and he preached Jesus Christ better than any man this side of the last 200 years. And whatever. Anyway, so, but the point is that Spurgeon and his depression, he dealt with that. And Zach Eswine, this pastor, he brings out some things in this book that really were an encouragement to me. Now, because I wondered, how in the world does this guy who led hundreds of thousands of people to the Lord at different times, I mean his ministries, not him, but God used him, and, to deal with all those things, he has a lot of quotes on depression. He said, anxiety does not empty tomorrow of its sorrows, but only empties today of its strength. A lot of quotes on that, why he suffered with it greatly. And in this book, what happens is he brings out, Zach Eswine, he brings out kind of how drastic Spurgeon got sometimes. Yet God still used him, yet he was still a faithful Christian, and yet God still blessed the work that he did. So I think that it's important that you kind of get an understanding of what this man went through at times. If you do, I think it'll help encourage you. You think, man, here's this guy that gets up and preaches these fiery sermons, and he's preaching on the gospel, and he's lifting up Christ, and man, he really went through it. So what I did was I highlighted this on my MacBook. Now, you're not going to see the highlights here, and the reason for that is because I don't know if there's copyright problems or anything like that or whatever. And I want you to order this guy's book, okay? I'm not making any money. I don't have a store. I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it to help you. My account's not monetized. I appreciate it when people give to our ministry, and we need it, but I'm not doing it for that reason. I don't sell this book. Although if I did sell books, and I could if I wanted to, I would sell a ton of books. I can guarantee you that. But anyway, and I'm not bragging. I'm just saying I could, because if you believe in something, you can sell it. I have sold a ton of books for people before. I've been to different, who was it? Oh, this summer when I was at Pastor Gary Long's, we were on a Baptist history tour. I sold a bunch of pastors all Gary Long's books. Scott can attest to that. I was walking around. Brother Scott was with us on this tour, and I was walking around telling these guys, hey, you need to get this one. This one is this one. You need to get this one. You need to get this one. You need to get this one. You get this one. I mean, it's so, but I didn't make any money off that, of course, and I'm not trying to. That's right. I have in times past. I used to sell books on eBay. And I still do sometimes that way. What I mean is this way I don't. I have a ton of books that I have for sale. I just haven't put them up for sale yet. But I don't use my YouTube page for that. I'll use Facebook or something, Marketplace or Bookfinder. I mean, not Bookfinder, but eBay or something like that, Anyway, but so I want to read you some of these quotes. And kind of walk you through some of these things as a Christian. And I hope that it encourages you. I hope that you kind of listen to him and say, you know what? Wow, if God got that guy through it, he'll get me through it too. He'll get me through whatever depression, discouragement, trial, tribulation I'm going through. He'll help me get through it. So Christ is glorified, because it's God that worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So Spurgeon, in the beginning of this book right here, he says, I am the subject of depressions of spirit so fearful that I hope none of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to. So what he was saying is he's been down so low before, so absolutely low before, that he hopes that nobody else ever gets down that low. The next one. We very speedily care for bodily diseases. They are too painful to let us slumber in silence, and they soon urge us to seek a physician or a surgeon for our healing. Oh, if we were as much alive to the more serious wounds of our inner man. Okay. So what he's saying is, you know how the Bible, let me show you this, how the scriptures talk about this right here. Let's see here. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit who can bear? A wounded spirit who can bear? The spirit of a man. So he's saying that, you know, if your inner man is just cast down, if it is just distraught, then man, you can't bear it. You'll just succumb to it. He said this, personally I know that there is nothing on earth that the human frame can suffer to be compared with despondency and prostration of mind. Nothing. So he is saying that, you know what, as low as you can go, people don't understand it. See, when you have a broken arm, if your arm is broke, people see that and they have compassion on you. If your hip gets replaced, if your back is messed up, if you have to have a surgery, but nobody looks at somebody that's depressed or going through depression a lot of times, and they're just like, come on, just put a smile on your face and get over it. What's the matter with you anyway? They don't realize how bad it really is. They don't realize how bad that it can get. Now Charles Spurgeon, he says here, Zach Eswine says here, he says, Charles was only 22 years old, embracing the 10th month of his young marriage. He and his wife were wading diaper deep into the first month of parenting their twin boys, and the new house is full of unpacked boxes, and boom, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes the worst disaster ever. And it was, let me see here. The Surrey Garden tragedy. And I'll show this to you right here. So in the midst, here's this young man right here, and he is preaching the gospel. This is Charles Spurgeon as a young man. 8 people are crushed to death at the Surrey Garden Music Hall when panic sweeps a crowd gathered to hear the Cambridgeshire lad, the Reverend Charles Spurgeon, just 25. Spurgeon was established as the most wonderful preacher in England. It is a Sunday evening fundraiser to help the young Baptist build his dream tabernacle. The crowd is estimated at 14,000 in the hall, designed for 10,000 with thousands more outside. The preaching was not even begun when people started surging toward the exits in terror. Some say they heard a cry, fire. The jammed balconies began to sway. The stairways and limited exits are soon on a horrific mass of tangled, desperate people. To calm his flock, Spurgeon appears on stage. A call for praise God, from whom all blessings flow, goes unanswered as the choir has fled the gallery. The cleric's choice of sermons, Proverbs 3:33, the Lord's curses on the house of the wicked, is hardly reassuring. He shouts above the din, there is a terrible day coming when the terror and alarm of this evening shall be as nothing. He soon faints and must be carried to safety by his deacons. Spurgeon remained too unwell to attend the subsequent inquest. His assistants blamed unnamed wicked designing men who had a wish to disrupt Spurgeon's message. The press attacks are immediate. Many noted the fact that Spurgeon's flock behaved no better in a crush than a music hall mob. Men were seen to knock down women and children to go to safety. So here is this man that is at the height of his young career. And I mean, there's 24,000 people around, they're going to listen to him preach. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this young man sees a mob of people that literally trample each other and try to destroy each other because somebody yells fire and they all get scared and they all run. So he tries to get his senses back and get back into the pulpit. But it doesn't. It doesn't happen that easy. See, this was a serious traumatic event. And in this serious traumatic event, it's going to affect him the rest of his life. He's not going to get over this that soon. Now, he'll eventually go on back to the pulpit, but he'll carry with him anxiety, triggered responses to anxiety, depression for the rest of his life. Physical ailments cause that, but also, remember that video I showed you about anxiety in the brain and how it burns those neurons fire wrong, and the amygdala is opened and it sends out flight or fright constantly? Well, that's what happened to him. And it was aggravated by physical ailments that would later kill him when he was 57 years old. But there's no doubt that this ended his life quicker. But there's also no doubt that he was able to do 10 times for the Lord that he ever would have been able to do if it wasn't for that. He said this, so he goes up to the pulpit, back again to the pulpit, and Zach notes this. He says, I almost regret this morning that I ventured to occupy this pulpit because I feel utterly unable to preach to you for your profit. I had thought that the quiet and repose of the last fortnight had removed the effects of that terrible catastrophe. But on coming back to the same spot again, and more especially standing here to address you, I feel somewhat of those same painful emotions which well nigh prostrated me before. You will therefore excuse me this morning. I have been utterly unable to study. O Spirit of God, magnify thy strength in thy servant's weakness, and enable him to honor his Lord, even when his soul is cast down within him. So, what he went through is the same thing that a lot of people go through with depression. Zach notes this. He says, sometimes our minds want to break because life stomped on us and God didn't stop it. One of the hardest things for a Christian to deal with in depression, one of the most difficult things for them to deal with anxiety and depression issues is, why didn't God stop it? Why did God let this happen to my mind? And that's something that takes a while to grapple with. And you have to leave it to God's control and trust God that he knows what's best for you. And you leave it to his hands, no matter what. His wife, in commenting about this, even the knees of Jesus, a Jesus follower will buckle. Charles's wife, Susanna, said of Charles, at the time, my beloved's anguish was so deep and violent that reason seemed to totter in her throne, and we sometimes feared that he would never preach again. They literally thought that here's this man that preached to thousands of people that will maybe never preach again because of his depression, because of how low his spirits went. And here's a man that was greatly used of God. There were times that the very sight of the Bible made Charles cry. Sometimes he would just look at the Bible and he would bawl. He went on to say something like this: depressions in our circumstances. In a chapter 2 called Depression in Our Circumstances, he quotes Spurgeon as saying this: "The mind can descend far lower than the body, for in it there are bottomless pits. The flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds and no more. But the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour." That's how depression works in the mind. It sounds very grave, and it is to the mind of the person that's going through it. It's extremely grave. Spurgeon went on to say this. He said, "Who is there of our race that is quite free from sorrows? Search the whole earth through, and everywhere the thorn and the thistle will be found. There is a time to weep, no matter who we are." There's going to be times of desertion, bereavement, the loss or death of a loved one, neglect or betrayal by a spouse, a family, or a friend, job loss, financial strain, disappointments and defeats, goals not reached or blocked. All those things could lead us down that pathway if we're not careful. Sometimes the multiplicity of trials over and over again. That's what it did for me. 2 or 3 years of unending trials as pastoring, and going through betrayal, going through lies, going through false accusations, going through a great number of things led to that. It's exactly what happened. And it's the compounded trials that come in waves that never seem to stop, which cause that. So some people think, it's interesting because some people don't think this is that important of a topic to talk about these things. But I guarantee, and I'm fine with it because I don't think it's going to be my top 50 list or anything like that. But I will say this: they are things that will help people with real life, everyday living, everyday battling. I mean, some of the stuff that, it warns you against apostasy on Kanye West and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, none of that stuff, that stuff is good to know to fight in the faith. But there's some things that you need for everyday living your life. Everyday living your life. Frolin asked the question, is there an acceptable timetable for depression? If it's real depression, the problem is, Frolin, that there is no time limit on it. It can last indefinitely. It can last for days. It can last for weeks. It can last for years. There is no timetable. And only God can lift you up. Usually after the loss of a loved one, the loss of a spouse, ending of a marriage, all those kind of things. Any of those things can lead to bouts of depression that last a very long time. But through it all, God will lift your spirits and give you the strength to continue to go on. God is that strength, because without the Lord, you wouldn't keep going right now. But the only reason why you are going is because God's breathing that endurance in you. So all I can tell you is that you just have to get up every morning and keep fighting. In itself, sadness or grief is God's gift to us. It's how we get through things. It's an act of faith and wisdom to be sad about things. So it is normal to be sad and to have grief. God made us to have that. Spurgeon goes on to say this. He says, there are certain forms of disease which so affect the brain and the whole nervous system that depression is a melancholy symptom of the disease. Quite involuntarily, unhappiness of mind, depression of spirit, and sorrow of heart will come upon you. You may be without any real reason for grief and yet may become among the most unhappy of men, because for the time your body has conquered your soul. And it's only for a time, but it does do that. There's a time when sometimes it takes control, kind of, or it dominates you, not, for a time. And for that, you battle through it, and it seems like you're being defeated. It seems like your mind is taking you over, but it isn't. God is still in control. You just have to continue to trust him. Depression comes involuntarily to us, as if the thing is a will of its own. Notice also that it is an identifiable reason for the proportion of the grief does not exist. We exhibit unhappiness of mind whether the circumstances of our lives are good or bad. Multiple sadnesses can also take a dark turn. Spurgeon said this, trial has succeeded trial and blasted all our hopes. Trial comes like waves on the sea rolling over one after another. Such an accumulation of aches and pains and weaknesses and sorrows can take their toll on us. Our boat begins to leak feverishly while the waves roll in. We patch this hole and that one. The storm brews. Our boat rises and falls. Soon more holes appear than we have stamina to patch. The waters break over us. We held out as long as we could. The last wave proved too much. Our boat sank. In this case, is such depression actually a grief out of proportion, or amid such suffering and depression itself the warranted grief? So, good point that he makes there. It's quite involuntarily. That's one thing you have to understand about depression. It's like I've talked to people and tried to help them, and you try to understand it yourself when you're going through it. But I've talked to people and tried to help them with it, and they want to blame themselves like, well, it's my fault I have this. No. I mean, it isn't. I mean, it could be that like sin brought you into that, and you repented of it and got that right or something, and that could be true for a Christian. But it isn't your fault that your mind sunk down so low. And yes, we can get things right with God, and that'll lift our spirits, but sometimes, I mean, you didn't invent that or make yourself be that way. No one woke up in the morning and said, I think I'll be depressed and have no joy, no temporal happiness in my life right now. That isn't what people do. That isn't how it works. I think this is an important quote right here, and I want to read this to you. Grief is depression in proportion to circumstance, while depression is grief out of proportion to circumstance. How we define what is healthy and proportionate cannot be measured by our own personal impatience or cultural decorum. Okay, so what that means is that we can't put a level of grief on what we've been through that's caused that. And sometimes you and I think, okay, well, I should be over this by now. It's like the question Frolin just asked me. I should be over this by now. I shouldn't have this anymore. Well, it isn't really based on what is healthy and proportionate cannot be measured by our personal impatience. So we can't really base it on the amount of sorrow that we have in that sense on our personal impatience for wanting to just get over with it and be done with it and not have it anymore. You see what I mean? We can't do that. We want to do that, but we can't do that. Circumstances leave their stains. I like a quote that Zach makes here. He says, depression calls for everyone even more compassion and acceptance. They sin, yes, but we've all been sinned against too. If we had known the trials that have assaulted them, we too might discover a life more attended by frightful glooms and miserable stares within our memories than we want. Memory, after all, is a powerful thing. It can both bless us and haunt us. Some of us are memory haunted. Circumstance left its stain. Such person needs mercy, not scolding. After all, on this side of heaven, there's no cure for sadness or depression. No saint or hero is immune. Room to cry loudly or long remains necessary, warranted, and nobly human. I think one of the things is that people don't grieve properly anymore. We're taught, we don't grieve funerals. We go back to work right away. Look, we take maternity leave and people go back to, work after having a baby and or husbands do or whatever the case may be. But, when somebody dies, it's like we just hold this service and then they're dead and then we just forget about it. But all that pain gets shoved down inside, all that grief and sorrow, and you just push forward with everything, and you don't take proper time to mourn things. Not taking proper time to mourn things is very dangerous. I can tell you that when trial after trial after trial came to me, betrayal, false accusations, just people hurting me, I didn't have time to stop and heal. I lost friends that I had for my whole ministry ever since I started it. People that I loved and cared for, that I pastored, I lost them all. Those people were gone out of my life and never talked to me again. And most people don't get that, what that does to a pastor. They don't have any clue what that does to them. They have no clue what that's like to have somebody that you loved and cared for, invested in, spent hours upon hours upon hours upon hours with, nurtured them through the hardest times of their lives, and then they walk out and they never talk to you again. Well, imagine that happened in a succession over and over again, and then betrayal for like 3 years. So what happened was that compounded, and eventually that grief has to somehow get out. Well, then what it does it's going to turn into anxiety. It's going to turn into grief. That's what it does. And see, Spurgeon went back to work, but that fearful night that all those things happened to him didn't go away. It would live with him for the rest of his life. The things that happen to us in our minds, they live with us. They go on with us. Now, we can get the victory over them, but they do they do work in, they do affect us for the rest of our lives. In this fallen world, sadness is an act of sanity. Our tears are the testimony of the sane. Charles, he says this, Christian faith on earth is neither an escape nor heaven. Charles speaks of certain Christians who from their position of health and wealth suggest that perfection and ease and immunity from human troubles describe what faithfulness to Jesus produces. Charles counters this notion and describes instead the tried people of God who do not often ride upon these high horses. The sheer number of their anxieties and cares forces them into a life which must frequently cry out to God and which exposes their being only mortal. We do not equate spiritual blessing, he says, with circumstantial ease. Certain of my brethren, said Spurgeon, are frequently in trouble. Their whole life is a floundering out of one slough of despond into another. You have had many losses in business, nothing but losses perhaps. You have had many crosses and disappointments and bereavements. Nothing prospers with you. It is no sign, beloved, that you are not a child of God. Remember that none of your trials can prove you to be a lost man. Amen. We who have not suffered depression from circumstances must learn the pastoral care of those who have. And that's important too, by the way. I learned that the hard way because I wasn't sensitive enough to that. The Lord allowed it to happen to me. When a person has been through a similar experience of depressions, he uses another tone of voice altogether. He knows that even if it is nonsense to the strong, it is not so to the weak. And so he adapts his remarks to that so that he cheers the sufferer where the other only inflicts additional pain. Broken-hearted one, Jesus Christ knows all your troubles, for similar troubles were his portion too. Which we're going to talk about sometime in the future. When I do next week, possibly next week, I'm going to do a book review on The Sympathies of Christ by Octavius Winslow. And it'll deal with this subject of depression, but it'll deal with it from a different side in getting to know Christ, his human side, his suffering side, and through the emotions of Christ. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet. I haven't figured that out yet. But I'm going to give one of those books away to somebody next week. One of those Sympathies of Christ. I'm going to mail it to you. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet. But I'm going to do that next week. I'm going to give away one of those copies next Wednesday. And we'll figure out how I'm going to do that. But the book was a very good book, and it was a blessing to me, as this one was. As well. But anyway, I'm going to mail you one of those. Somebody. We'll see who. We'll see how we do it. But anyway, let's see. I'll give you another quote here. He said this, I would not blame all those who are much given to fear, for in some it is rather their disease than their sin, and more their misfortune than their fault. Did you hear what he said, though? I would not blame all those. More their misfortune than their fault. Like they didn't produce that fear in them. But they have it. Sometimes depression doesn't stem from painful circumstances, according to Charles. Some persons are constitutionally sad. Sometimes we are marked by melancholy from the moment of our birth. Some people, for some reason, they're born with it, and they have it. And it's not from a tragic thing that took place. Mine was from, was from, tragedies. Mine was from circumstances that overcome my spirit, basically, for a while. And in that case, but others, they have it from their birth. But it's not their fault. They didn't give themselves that. It's just the way it is. He said, to begin, our imagination can possess a darker edge. As Charles observed, all our birds are owls or ravens. When one is born with a melancholy temperament, he sees tempest brewing even in the calm. So automatically thinks something bad is going to happen right away. I mean, if he sees a bird, it's a raven or an owl. It's not a nice little Tweety bird. It's the way they look at things. Desponding people, depressed people, they're prone to exaggerate fears. According to Charles, he says they can find reason for fear where no fear is. They just find it. This makes it harder for us to find relief or assurance of safety. If things are calm, we look for what harm awaits us. If things go wrong, we assume that the worst is yet to come. We imagine doomed futures, and though none of the bad things we imagine have happened to us, we convert our suspicions into realities and torture ourselves with them in our own imaginations. So unlike others who doubts and fears subside, our constitutional temperament is such that it keeps on doubting. Worries and anxieties of many kinds assail us. On the very slightest turn of circumstances, we begin to fret. Everybody frets and worries, of course, but the disease intensifies it. It makes it worse. It compounds it. Sometimes our ordinary responsibilities, therefore, make us anxious and overwhelmed. Performance anxiety undoes us, says Zach. Little things feel like giants. Spurgeon says a man may feel that he ought to do so well that for that very reason he may not do as well as he might. An overwhelming feeling of responsibility may breed paralysis. Unless we can do it perfectly, we won't try it at all. Sound familiar to some of you out there that are struggling with that? Often then, feeling unable to do what our responsibilities demand, we are harassed by accusing and condemning thoughts regarding our every mistake and blunder, both real and imagined. We can finally go numb. It is as if we shut down and feel so much that we feel nothing at all. Depression is like a darkness that drapes over us wherever we go. When people aren't in the dark, they're afraid of anything and everything. When we feel constantly in dark mentally, we quiver and tremble at what lurks around the corner. But sometimes it has its seasons of remission when it's not so bad. We are not harassed each and every moment. Sometimes rest comes. The cellar doors open and we walk out quite happily into the sunshine, glad and at ease. But the black crow wants and waits to stoop down upon us again, and sometimes he does. A melancholy imagination might intensify what ails us, but nonetheless, depression of spirit stems from a real disease. It is not imaginary. These biological cases, Charles says plainly, require the business of the physician more than of the pastor or the theologian. Pastors and Christians need medical professionals on their pastoral care team. Now, I do have a slight difference with some of these guys. He recommends with him. Now, Spurgeon never, I looked it up. Spurgeon's brother also said Spurgeon never took any medication for that, besides what a doctor would give him for aches and pains or something in his body, because he had Bright's disease and a few different other diseases. But I don't believe in taking medication for it. I don't believe in taking psychotropics for it. I don't believe in doing that. I think that's very dangerous. Now listen to me. If you're on them, I'm not telling you to cold turkey quit them. Don't do that. You ask a physician to help you get off of them and to monitor you and help you get through it. I do not advocate stopping psychotropics overnight or cold turkey or anything like that. You can harm yourself. Don't do that. Always get help. Always seek a physician's help. Okay? With that. But I don't think that you should take medication like that on a regular basis. I don't think so. Now, I have seen people get so hyped up that they need a tranquilizer or something in a hospital, or somebody will give them something to calm their nerves. The Bible talks about that. When the heart is so distraught, that there were things that could be used for that purpose, medicinally. But it was administered by somebody else, not you having a fifth of Jack on you and slamming it. That's not what it says. Anyway, but obviously you have to be careful because it could be hormonal. A lot of things are hormonal with women and things like that too as well, that they need to get their hormones checked out, make sure that that's not causing that. So, by the way, another book that I recommend that I read, which may be hard for some of you to read because it was written 400 years ago. Yvonne says it could be deadly. Don't stop antidepressants without help. Amen. That's right. Always seek a physician's help with that. They're very dangerous. Very dangerous to stop taking. They're very dangerous to be on, period, but they're even more dangerous when you skip one. More dangerous. He says this. He says, there are some true souls whom God loves, Charles observes, who yet do not often enjoy a sunshiny day. They are very dark as to their hope and their joy, and some of them have perhaps for months lost the light of God's countenance. And I know what he's talking about. He's talking about desertion and dealing with that and suffering through that. I know what he means by that. I've experienced that. Depression can so vandalize our joy and our sense of God that no promise of his can comfort us in the moment, no matter how true or kindly spoken. At its worst, everything in the world looks dark. Even God's mercies frighten us and rise like a hideous portents of evil before our mind's eye. So what did he mean by that? He preached that in a sermon called The Garden of the Soul. Why did he say that? Because when you're going through depression and it's hitting you and you're like, anxiety is up, and you hear a sermon, whatever about hell is in that sermon, whatever bad is in that sermon is the only thing you hear. Yeah, but I got saved by the grace of God. I know when I was saved. I know. But your mind is going to tell you, oh no, that's you. You're going to hell. You're a reprobate. You're this, you're that. You can only see even the promises of God bring you no comfort. And you're like, well, that must mean they're not saved then. No, when they go through depression, your mind has a mind of its own, and then Satan uses that. Remember what we talked about with Job? How Job's friends, what they were doing? And that devil came to Job's friend and told him this stuff, and he was pressing on him. So it's important to understand that sometimes sermons don't give you comfort. Sometimes reading the Bible won't comfort a depressed person. Now, I'm not talking about somebody who's out fornicating, sleeping around, drinking booze, living like the devil, running around, cursing God, watching pornography. Well, of course they're not going to have any peace. I'm talking about people real Christians that live for God, that sometimes they fall into this despondency. They have a feeble mind. So you want to be careful about. Man is a double being. He's composed of a body and a soul, and each of the portion, which I would say triple in that sense, a tripart. But each of the portions of man may receive injury and hurt. Depression is not a sin, though sins can result from it. We may get depressed in spirit. We may be nervous, fearful, timid. We may almost come to the borders of despair, and this apart from sin. You may not be in any sin at all, and your mind may just be zapped. It can happen. Absolutely, it can happen. So, to people that are depressed, that's what they go through, and it's like an enigma. Depression is not unique to us. After citing historical examples, there are men like Martin Luther, Isaac Newton, William Cooper, then biblical examples such as Job, King David, Elijah. I'll give you some others. He-Man, Asaph the Recorder. Yep. Lots of Bible examples of that. You are not the first child of God who has been depressed or troubled. Even amongst the noblest of men and women who ever lived, there have been much of this kind of thing. Do not therefore think that you are quite alone in your sorrow. Even though you may go to bed in the dark, you will wake up in the eternal daylight. Many of God's children have went through that, have went through the darkness of those doors of depression. Many of them, in the Bible, there were many of them that suffered that. As we look through the Psalms, I've read those to you before. Psalm 77. Let's go there real quick. Psalm 77. I hope this is helping somebody out there today. I know it gives you a lot to think about. I cried unto God with my voice, even unto God with my voice, and he gave ear unto me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My sore ran in the night, and ceased not. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. Well, that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to rejoice when you remember God. Not when you're in depression, though. That doesn't happen sometimes. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. What was the problem? He was depressed. Thou holdest mine eyes waking. His mind wouldn't shut up, so his eyes just stayed awake. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I've been there before. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with mine own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. Will the Lord cast off forever, and will he be favorable no more? Is his mercy clean gone forever? You know, this guy's not going through a picnic here. You understand that, right? This ain't a poetry recital. This man is pouring out his heart to God here, and he's saying, look, this is what I'm going through. Did God forget to be gracious? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Some of you say, well, that guy just wasn't saved. He just wasn't a Christian. He didn't love God. He must have been in secret sin. He must have been that way, because you know what? No Christian should ever feel that way. Well, they do. They do. There are a lot of people, though, that will tell you earnestly that your salvation in Jesus is threatened and put into question because of depression. But he says this, just as a man with asthma or a woman born mute will likely remain this way even though they love Jesus, so our mental disorders and melancholy inclinations often remain with us too. Conversion to Jesus isn't heaven, but it's foretaste of heaven. This side of heaven, grace secures us, but doesn't cure us. There are lines of weakness in the creature which even grace does not efface. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's a blessing to you, Terry. That's good. I'm glad. You just keep holding on to the Lord. He'll take care of you. Though substantial healing can come, Charles reminds us that often it waits till heaven to complete its full work. He says this. Now, here's a man, right, that preached the gospel to so many people, that saw so many people saved. Walked with God, loved God, stayed separated, taught pastors, ordained more men, sent out missionaries, sent millions of dollars across the world, had 10 different orphanages, was the head of 28 different, I think it was 28. I'm throwing that number out there. That's not right. I don't know how many organizations he was the head of. And I'm talking about the charitable head of. That means that the Metropolitan Tabernacle supported these children that had no fathers and mothers, to the tune of hundreds. He said this, "We do not profess that the religion of Christ will so thoroughly change a man as to take away from him all his natural tendencies. It will give the despairing something that will alleviate that despondency, but as long as that is caused by a low state of body or a diseased mind, we do not profess that the religion of Christ will totally remove it. No, rather we do see every day that amongst the best of God's servants, there are those who are always doubting, always looking to the dark side of every providence, who look at the threatening more than at the promise, who are ready to write bitter things against themselves." Let me show you where that comes from. I was just doing this in my devotions a few days ago. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him." Now, the first part of that was right. The second part, he was going to answer to God for. Anyway, that's another story. But verse number 26 says, "For thou writest bitter things against me, and make me to possess the iniquities of my youth." Now, I want to remind you of something, okay? You may be on this broadcast today, and this may happen to you. You may have been saved for so many years, and all of a sudden, all these sins of your youth are coming back to your mind. And it is as if you feel as if you're guilty of all those sins again, and that they're poured out on you, and it's causing you sorrow in your heart. But listen, that doesn't mean those sins are not forgiven. But there is something about this life that we can never erase what we've done in this life. God will erase it in the next one. But suffice it enough that you sorrow in this world over some sins that you committed, and you hate them even more, because God made me do that. Over the last year, what God's made me do is reflect on my life, allowed me to do, reflect on my life, and hate the sin that I committed more before I was saved and even after I was saved, some of the sins, that I hate them even more now. And they bring me sorrow, and I hate the fact that I did those things. But it's so I don't sorrow for eternity. So he allowed me to sorrow here. And he may do the same thing to you. He may allow you to sorrow here, like he did Job. Job was going through an immense amount of depression. And all he could think of was, he thought, well, my sins, they're done. They're done. You know, they're forgiven. As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our transgressions from us. Yes, he has. But the sting of some of those things, they still affect the mind years later. You know why? Because when we're in our youth, we're so foolish. We do so many things, and we don't think about the drastic consequences of them. And then when we get older, we think about them. And they bother us. And they bother us worse than ever. And that's normal, because they're gonna. That doesn't mean you're not saved. That doesn't mean you're not God's child, and all of a sudden He might return some of that terror of the law to you for a little while. God might do that. That's what Job said, for thou writest bitter things against me. And a lot of it is us. We're writing bitter things against ourselves because of what's going on in our minds. So we write bitter things against ourselves. So we have to remember that. Depression. Here's another thing that Spurgeon said that I thought was interesting. He said, depression of spirit is no sign of declining grace. That was taken from a sermon that you could listen to, or I mean, it's probably out there you can listen to. I don't know if it is, but you can actually read it if you'd like. It's called Sweet Stimulants for the Fainting Soul. Anyway, but it is Christ and not the absence of depression that saves us. So we declare this truth. Our sense of God's absence does not mean that He is so. Though our bodily gloom allows us no feeling of His tender touch, He holds on to us still. Our feelings of Him do not save us. He does. Our hope, therefore, does not reside in our ability to preserve a good mood, but in His ability to bear us up. Jesus will never abandon us with our downcast heart. Spurgeon said this. He said, perhaps you are not well, or you have had an illness that has told much upon your nervous system, and you are depressed, and therefore it is that you think that the grace is leaving you. But it will not. Your spiritual life does not depend upon nature, else it might expire. It depends on grace, and grace will never cease to shine till it lights you into glory. Amen. Now, I'm just reading you quotes. I'm not reading you everything in this book, obviously. There's a lot of good stuff in this book. I recommend you read it. It's not a hard read. It's a really easy one, and I think it's under 200 pages. It's a really easy one. So it is with God. While our bodies sometimes make a wreck of our moods and cast doubts upon our faith, He holds us secure, though we know it not, and our fit continues to rage. Remember, depression is a misfortune, not a fault. Charles reminded us in the opening quote of this chapter, he said that, right? That doesn't, just because you have that kind of struggle doesn't warrant condemnation from others. A lot of people say this, in contrast to those who would tell you to get stronger and plead your strengths with God. Charles counters and tells us the opposite. Let your weakness plead with God through Jesus Christ. His mercies are large enough, deep enough, wide enough, high enough to hold secure what you cannot. Grace for your need rises to the occasion. Your hope is not your health, but His ability to be the strength you need. God has a compassionate God towards us for all them that suffer. He distinguishes those who mocked Him from God Himself. And here's what Spurgeon said. Because some people, he said this, he said, some of you may be in great distress of mind, a distress out of which no fellow creature can deliver you. You are poor, nervous people at whom others often laugh. I can assure you that God will not laugh at you. He knows all about that sad complaint of yours. So I urge you to go to Him, for the experience of many of us has taught us that the Lord is great, the Lord is gracious and full of compassion. Then he goes on to speak about spiritual depression as well. Spiritual sorrows are the worst of mental miseries, said Spurgeon. William Cowper, who's a man that was best friends with John Newton, and he wrote some beautiful hymns. He said, "But misery still delights to trace its semblance in another's case." Religious melancholy happens. It is hardly, one person said it this way, it's hardly necessary to say that Christianity, undistorted and preached in its just proportions, is calculated to prevent, not cause insanity. The exciting cause of religious melancholy is sometimes to be traced to fiery denunciations of a well-meaning but injudicious preacher. So what he's saying is sometimes people get worse off because the preacher just nails them so hard and he doesn't comfort them at all. You know, the story of John Newton and William Cowper is a great story. You ought to, maybe I'll read it to you sometime. I'll put it that way. We'll leave it at that. In this tug of war with God and depression, Charles recognized a spiritual reality to depression. He felt that depression itself had circumstantial, biological, and spiritual contributors and challenges. But he also believed the spiritual side of things could originate its own kind of depression. In other words, someone with biological depression will have spiritual realities to contend with. But a person might suffer from spiritual depression even though they have no circumstantial or biological depression to speak of. John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress gave language to Charles as he tried to help those who suffered, as well as describe what could assail him. In Bunyan's story, the main character named Christian falls into the Slough of Despond, is later captured by Giant Despair, and then beaten mercilessly in the Doubting Castle. Despondency, despair, and double join together to create spiritual miseries in our lives. What is spiritual melancholy? At its core, its spiritual depression concerns real or imagined desertions by God. We feel in our senses that he is angry with us, or we have done something to forfeit his love, or he has toyed with us and left us on a whim. The irony of desertion is that God's absence feels overwhelmingly close to us. So he's talking about what I've preached on before, desertion, where to your comfortable senses, God is gone. After you've been saved for many years, all of a sudden, boom, God's gone. You don't feel his presence any longer. According to Charles, when a person knows that God is with them, he or she may bear great depression of spirit. But if we believe God has left us in our miseries and hardships, there is a torment within the breast, a torment which I can only liken, Charles says, to the prelude of hell. And that's true. It literally feels like hell on earth. Charles says persons can bear a bleeding body and even a wounded spirit. But a soul conscious of desertion by God is beyond conception, unendurable. To begin with, what are the symptoms of that? He says, to begin with, we magnify every weakness, limit sin and imperfection within us. We terribly doubt whether we are Christians at all and become tormented with fear that we are frauds and living sham lives. Wait a minute. So you're telling me that the guy that got up and preached to thousands of people, had the power of God, saw many people saved, did the moving of the Holy Ghost, God did all this work in his life, in his ministry? Yeah, and he couldn't see any of it. Sometimes he thought he was just a fake. I know what that feels like. I understand that. I've been there before. I've dealt with that. And I'm not talking about he felt like he was a fake because he was living in sin or looking at pornography or fornicating or drinking booze or running around partying or living a fake life or anything like that. No. To the best of his ability, by the grace of God, he is walking in the Spirit and living for God. Here's what he says here. We can become fixated in sore distress with questions we cannot answer, enigmas we cannot solve, and knots of difficulty we cannot untie. So what happens is, to the depressed Christian, Charles Spurgeon is saying, well, there's enigmas that they can't answer. Well, at my conversion, what about this? And what about that? And, well, maybe I didn't do this enough, or maybe I didn't do that enough, or maybe this isn't enough, or maybe that, or I know this now and I didn't know that then, so maybe this. You become tied in knots inside of you, where literally you're like, you can't be, you just don't think you're real. He says we turn to all or nothings. That's true. Anxiety is like that. Depression and anxiety, they're like that. You turn to all or nothings. Well, it's either all right or all wrong. There is nothing in between. Well, that's not true. You may be doing a lot of wonderful things. The fruit of the Spirit is shown in your life. You may be lacking in some areas, like all Christians are, but all of a sudden, nope, it's over. You're the reprobate the preacher was preaching about. You're the one going to hell. He preached a gospel message. I knew it was for me. It has to be for me. He thinks I'm not real. God told him I'm not real. Whatever the case may be. That's what you do. That's what depressed people do. Christians that have depression, that's what they do. Says, because we do not know everything, we believe we cannot know anything. We may then view the Bible itself in extremes. It becomes either a book of whips, gleeful to strike us by its every word with our impending doom, or in reverse, it becomes a dry word, uninteresting, irrelevant towards us. If the Bible happily whips and dooms us, we writhe and moan for the absent God to deliver us. If the scriptures have dried up, we become numb and indifferent. Dreadful apathy sets in. We want to feel but cannot feel. Spiritual insomnia may toss and turn us. Restless we strive, agonize, fret, and worry. We work all the harder, never able to do enough, conscious only that our results are too small and that God remains constantly displeased. We never measure up, and we spend our days fretting and anxious that God will walk away shaking his head at us unless we get all right or good enough. Which obviously is not scriptural. Eventually we wear out to wear thin. The enjoyment of service evaporates. The fretfulness which pines over details spoils the whole, and the worker becomes a mere drudge and scullion. These imagined withdrawals of God from us can torture the mind. But the most terrible of these spiritual symptoms, Charles calls heaviness of spirit. And opposite to what I've just described, this kind of distance from God is real and not imagined. We see the true horror of sin. We feel ourselves worthy of legitimate judgment and beyond all hope or worthiness of forgiveness. But we see no remedy and no hope for recovery. Charles urges us that if we suffered half an hour of this kind of true conviction of actual sin, we would have more compassion on those who suffer in this way. To be impaled upon your own sins, pillared by your own conscience, shot at by your own judgment, as with the barbed arrows, this is the anguish and torment. Next to the torment of hell, the bitterness of true remorse and despair reveals the worst of our sorrows, worse even than death itself. In all these symptoms, says Zach, we misjudge our hope. We imagine ourselves with no remedy or forgiveness or reconciliation, as if God did not so love the world and did not give his only son, begotten Son. Making matters worse is that others commonly think we are over the top and too often condemn and even ridicule him who is of sad soul. So not only do we feel deserted by God, but we also feel shamed and deserted by those who talk about God. We therefore suffer a double sense of abandonment and feel no hope for healing, no Savior from sin, no sympathy for the sorrowing. We reason in tortures. It makes you spiritually vulnerable, is what it does. For example, if someone doesn't like us, this rejection looms large in times of depression. What would have stung us for a day now turns into a desire to get away from people. That's what Satan wants you to do. You can't do that, though. But you'll start running away from people because you're like, oh, well, nobody cares about me anyway. I'm just going to stay away from everybody. Likewise, if someone struggles already with biological or circumstantial depression, they are more vulnerable to spiritual sorrows. It is hard enough to get through the day without adding the displeasure of God to the trauma that already trounces us. Charles tells us personally how his own ongoing struggle with doubts is made harder due to depression. He said this, now imagine he's preaching to thousands of people. It is very hard to stand day by day and say, no, I cannot doubt my God, when we are already assaulted by that perpetual stabbing, cutting, and hacking at our faith. It is not easy to endure. So helps to this, he mentions, is 1, remember to account for one's context of life. Slow your judgment down. When you see men faint, do not blame them. Perhaps by their faintness they have proved of what stuff they are made. They have done so as much as flesh and blood can do, and therefore they are faint. Who knows what multiplied sorrows they have endured? Remember, number 2, it is required more faith for some to do less than you. Some need not be afraid of the slough of despond, for they carry a slough within their own hearts and are never out of it, or it is never out of them. There is much to admire in the perseverance required of these dear ones and in the Savior who cares for them. Our hearts need compassion. Trembling fellow pilgrims, we would play the harp for you, that if possible you may forget your fears a while. And if you cannot altogether rise superior to your glooms, yet may you, for this hour at least, take unto yourselves the wings of eagles and mount above the midst of doubt. Also, Charles Spurgeon was quick to let you know that the enemy, Satan, is going to use those spiritual despondencies against you. In other words, he said the great enemy makes a dead set against anxious souls. He delights in taking sorrows and making more of them. Like giant despair, Satan lashes his poor slave with excess of malice, if by any means he may utterly destroy his victim before the deliverer arrives. Accusation, condemnation, and cruel whispers pile upon the already wheezing sufferer. If we are not careful, we imitate this accusing cruel one in our attempts to help arouse ourselves or our depressed friends. For when depression assails us, with Cooper, we tell ourselves that we are not a true child of God. We have no hope. Our sins have found us out. Our questions are too numerous. Our future is doomed. Our present worthy only of apathy, and our forgiveness impossible. That's when the ancient evil creature smiles. Yes, you are right. Oh, but it's worse than you thought. All is lost. You are abandoned, and rightfully so. You are forfeit. Stay down. You are out of reach. It is too late for you, sinner. They are better off without you. You deserve to die. That's how Satan works. His advice is, feed not this frenzy of the soul. He says many circumstantial, biological, and spiritual pains outlast our abilities to control them or understand them. But when we face this ancient foe, the devil, there remains only one thing we can and must do: fight. The soul is broken in pieces, lanced, pricked, with knives, dissolved, racked, and pained. It knows not how to exist when it gives way to fear. Up, Christian, you are a sorrowful countenance. Up and chase your fears. Why would you be ever groaning in your dungeon? Why should giant despair forever beat you with his crabtree cudgel? Up, drive him away. Now, Zach, he has a good point. He says, this is what you ought to do. How do we do this, he says? In essence, we use this phrase. You might be right, but Jesus. You might be right. Things are worse than I thought, but Jesus. You might be right. All is lost, but Jesus. You might be right. I am abandoned, but Jesus. You might be right. I am forfeit, but Jesus. You might be right. I should stay down, but Jesus. You might be right. It would be too late for me, but Jesus. You might be right. I am out of reach, but Jesus. You might be right. I am a sinner, but Jesus. You might be right. They might be better off without me, but Jesus. You might be right. I could deserve to die, but Jesus. We plead not ourselves, but the promises of Jesus. Not our own strengths, but His. Our weaknesses, yes, but His mercies. Our way of fighting is to hide behind Jesus who fights for us. Our hope is not in the absence of our regret, or misery, or doubt, or lament, but the presence of Jesus. Doubting Castle may be very strong, but he who comes to fight with the giant despair is stronger still. In pleading Jesus, we embrace what Charles called a blessed kind of despair, which is the work of God Himself. A despair of self-salvation, a despair of washing away your own sins, a despair of obtaining any merit of your own by which you can become acceptable in the sight of God. That is a blessed kind of despair. But in reference to any other sort of despair, I cannot say anything good. Okay, so he talks about a sermon that Spurgeon was a little harsh on people that had depression, but due to his own depression, and then he backed off a little bit, which, let's see if there's anything else. I like the advice he gives. Diagnosis doesn't cure. So once you know you have depression, it doesn't mean it's cured. But he says this, especially judge not the sons and daughters of sorrow. Allow no ungenerous suspicions of the afflicted, the poor, and the despondent. Do not hastily say they ought to be more brave and exhibit a greater faith. Ask not why they are so nervous and so absurdly fearful. No, I beseech you, remember that you understand not your fellow man. You know, it's interesting. 25 years later, after that hoax that killed 8 people when someone yelled fire, Charles was about to address a large audience during a session of the Baptist Union. He was older now, middle-aged, a seasoned pastor, and well-known. All seats were taken and hundreds were pressing in. Charles walked onto the platform and became entirely unmanned, leaning his head on his hand. He said, "Why?" Charles experienced what we today might call flashback. A moment in time perfectly harmless that triggers memories of a previous moment that was full of harm. The one looks like the other and sets off trauma response in our bodies and minds. Even the grace to preach well did not entirely recover the agitation of his nervous system. 25 years later, right? Can happen. You know, shouldn't you be over it by now? That's the ungenerous suspicions, he says, that those are. Anyway, so he talks about how they cannot understand, people cannot understand those things. Yep, let's see here. Hang on a second. Let's see. Run away from these sorrowful ones? By no means, he said. But grace must secure our hope, otherwise we too will soon feel that the sunlight is gone. Both the sufferer and the one trying to help can be weighed down with the helpless feelings of it all, and even suffer guilt and shame for it. Yeah, I've dealt with that before, trying to help other people through depression, and it tries to kick in yours. Anyway, Charles says this. He says, the hard truth is that serious depressions do not disappear overnight. Depression is best understood rather as a kind of mental arthritis. All right. It's like a mental darkness, he said, in which you are disturbed, perplexed, worried, troubled, not perhaps about anything tangible. David cried that out. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Why art thou disquieted within me? Hope thou in God. He's like, why? Why do I have to go through this? Why is this like this? Anyway, so lots of good stuff there. He says, for the sufferer, causes and cures may evade you for a while. You may be surrounded with all the comforts of life, and yet be in a wretched, more gloomy than death of the spirits, be depressed. You may have no outward cause, whatever for sorrow, and yet in mind be dejected. The brightest sunshine will not relieve your gloom. At such a time you may be vexed with cares, haunted with dread, and scared with things that distract you. Anyway, so he gets lots of good advice in there about what to do about that. A language of sorrows. He says, he who feebly expounds these words knows within himself more than he would care to dare to tell of the abyss of inward anguish. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind. First, he says, one thing this man says is depression ruins our manners toward God because it teaches us to exist without gratitude and tempts us to answer the purpose of our existence as simply to wait for death, since the pleasures of earth are overrated. Wow, that's true. Anyway, man, I could go on and on and on. This book is long, and we don't have time to go through it. I figured I'd get through a bunch of it, and I did. I mean, I'm not trying to read you the whole thing or anything. He has a lot of different cures that he talks about in scriptures, the metaphors. He uses a lot of metaphors in the Bible that deal with depression and how to encourage people. And metaphors, he says, invites us to ask the questions and then listen. We learn patience and appreciations through metaphors. That's why he taught so much in those metaphors and things of that nature, too, to try to encourage people. He said, divine sympathy is your teacher, dear caregiver, your ally and friend, dear sufferer. Let his sorrow's language help you. So in the Bible, there's a language, is what he's talking about, for metaphors in there. And he uses metaphors of sorrow and different things in the scriptures to kind of help people to he says this. Says, when I used to laugh at Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so for being so nervous. Now that I feel the torture myself, I am sorry that I was ever hard on her. Says another, I used to think of such and such person that he must be a fool to be always in so gloomy a state of mind. But now I cannot help sinking into the same desponding frames, and I would to God that I had been more kind to him. Yes, we should feel more the prisoner if we knew more about the prison. And that's true. That's very true. I was harsh on people. He says, we are harsh with sufferers. Stuff and nonsense. Try to exact yourself. But when he does this, he says one of the most cruel things that can be said to the sufferer. By trying to help, he only inflicts additional pain. He said to speak harshly to people who are very depressed in spirit, saying, really, you ought to rouse yourself out of that state. All he does is make it worse. We judge people according to our circumstances sometimes, which harms them. There are a great many of you who appear to have large stock of faith, but it is only because you are in very good health and your business is prospering. If you happen to get a disordered liver or your business should fail, I should not be surprised if 9 parts out of 10 of your wonderful faith should evaporate. Jesus teaches us about those who lay up heavy burdens on others, but do not lift a finger to help them. We still think that trite sayings or a raised voice can help deep wounds. A person may have a great spiritual sorrow, and someone who does not at all understand his grief may proffer to him a consolation which is far too slight. We say to persons in deep distress things which have really aggravated him and his malady too. In this regard, Charles teaches us the scriptures. Whoever sings the songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment. He's not using the King James there, but we try to control what should be rather than surrender what is. We must not judge harshly as if things were as we would theoretically arrange them, but we must deal with things as they are. And it cannot be questioned that some of the best believers are at times sorely put to it, even to know whether they are believers at all. The scriptures teach us about Job's friends who struggled at this very point. We resist humility, he says, not knowing. You know, when you help people, if you have a sound of reality, it helps them. Those that suffer can help people that have suffered. And I think the Lord has used my suffering, and I know he has because of the testimonies that people have sent me. And some of you have testified to this. He's used the things that I've went through to help other people. And that gives me no glory. And the reason why it doesn't is because it doesn't make me feel good about myself. You can't glory in it. I can only glory in my infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me, but I can't glory in anything being some super strong person, you know. It just doesn't work that way. Anyway, so lots of good stuff there. He said this, the mind can descend far lower than the body, for in it there's a bottomless pit. We talked about that. Anyway, so I think that gets you the point there. There's some great cures he has. He talks about Jesus and depression and things that the Lord went through as being a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Spurgeon said the Garden of Sorrows was a picture of the mental depression of Jesus. He said bodily pain should help us to understand the cross. Charles says, but mental depression should make us apt scholars at Gethsemane. The sympathy of Jesus is the next most precious thing to his sacrifice. See, that helps you to understand who Christ is more when you enter into the fellowship of his sufferings. Maybe what I'll do is just stop right there for now because we're at the 2-hour mark here. And I think what I'll do is stop, and then I'll pick that up next week maybe with that and get into the sympathies of Christ because it's a great segue into that to kind of help. And I'll maybe use both of that. But anyway, so how's everybody doing over here? We got, who's on here today? We got the Sullivan Kid, Andrea Bales, Big Whale, Joe McDonnell, Pink Ishus, okay? Becca, Hannah, Carl Winters, Teresa, my dad, Aaron with the blue wrench, Rob Lee, Chad Goins, let's see, Stephen, Peter, Mary, hope you're doing well, Mary, Good deal. Yeah, God bless you too. All right, does anybody have any questions here before I get out of here? I can't believe it's 4 o'clock already. Man, it went by fast for me. I don't know for some of you if it did, but it sure did for me. It went by extremely fast. Hard to believe that amount of time, but I mean, we're just under 2 hours right now. We got about 4 minutes, but anybody have any questions or anything at all? Or maybe want to say hi. Maybe you haven't said hi on here. Maybe there's 41 of you listening right now. Maybe somebody wants to say hi that hasn't said hi and tell us where you're from or whatever, so we can say hi to you. Give you a chance to do that here. Let's see. Caddy from Florida. Where you at over there in Florida? I've got a few people that listen over there. You know, I look at the sermon audio charts and it tells me like where people are from. Lots of people listen from Canada. Lots of people listen from England as well. Nate Gross from Indiana. Hope you're doing well, Nate. All right, good deal. let's see. I know who's from Minnesota. I already know all of you, obviously. Let's see. Mike C. from Chicago. I know that guy. Let's see. Romans 10:13. I know him too. He's been listening for years. Well, I hope you're all doing well. I'm gonna listening from parts unknown. Yeah, I know, Carl. I know. We all know. But I better get going. Hey, guess what I'm working on tonight? I'm going to be doing tonight. I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint tonight. And I'm not going to be back in the book of Acts yet. But I've kind of got this. I've been teaching on angels, right? Angelology and everything like that. And so then I started thinking about these creatures a little bit more. And I decided to go back into Revelation chapter 9. And I decided to teach on these creatures from the underworld, these hybrids from hell. So I'm going to be teaching a PowerPoint on these creatures from the underworld, these hybrids from hell. I'm going to be teaching on them. And I'm only going to get to the first creatures, the locust type men and all that today. And then tomorrow, or next week, I'll get to the other ones that are in there. And that'll be, anyway, so it'll be interesting to do that. And hopefully Luke, I'm trying to get Luke to be able to put that on as quick as possible with the PowerPoint, okay? So he can do the video with the PowerPoint. So you can see the video, or you can see the PowerPoint display on there as you're listening to it. And we'll see how it goes. So Lord willing, we'll be able to do that. But I plan on doing that tonight. And then, Lord willing, back in Psalm 103. Psalm 103 on Sunday. And Keeping the Kids, part 4 on Sunday. And Baptist history, still covering the Baptist doctrine. Looking forward to that. And want to get through those Baptist distinctives so I can get right into the history and get moving. But I first believe that's the proper way to do it. So anyway, that's what we're doing. Pray for our ministry. Pray for our finances. Pray for our needs. That the Lord would continue to provide for us and that he would take care of us and continue to bless that way so we can keep doing what God's called us to do as we step out by faith and continue on for him in that way. So pray for us there, that God would continue to provide for us as you know, expenses keep going up. So we have to keep trusting the Lord through it, and God's very good to us. So anyway, have a good night, and we will be back on Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. And I think I know what I'm going to discuss, and it's really creepy. It's more AI stuff, and man, is it creepy. But anyway, we'll save that for Friday. Have a good night, everybody. God bless you.